Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Hope y'all having a great day. And with no further ado, let's get into the 2021 redraft. And we only have one more episode of this redraft series, which will be coming next week for 2020. And then we'll have the 2026 draft for the entire week. So with the first pick, I'm going to keep it the same in picking Trevor Lawrence. I know it might seem like really first overall, but I mean, Lawrence has been the best quarterback out of anybody in this class, a legit franchise guy, and has really, I mean, he hasn't lived up to the pre-draft type, which, like, unless he won like 8 Super Bowls and was a unit like an automatic Hall of Famer right away, first ballot Hall of Famer. I think it was going to be hard to live up to those lofty expectations. Now, can he? Yeah, now that he hopefully has his coach for the next 5, 10 plus years and Liam Cohen, it's possible. But I don't think the Jags regret this pick. I think they regret some of the other decisions they made, like hiring Urban Meyer and free agency and drafting, but they don't regret picking Trevor Lawrence. So I'm going to keep him the pick. But I understand, maybe you going with like Micah or Jamar Chase or somebody else at number one because while Lawrence is a starter level guy, a franchise quarterback, he hasn't lived up to being the first overall pick. On to the second overall pick with the Jets, I think could go multiple different directions. Could go with Jamar Chase, who has been amazing through the first 5 years of his career. Could go with Micah because Robert Saleh was the coach, so maybe he would have wanted to get an elite defensive player on his team. Yeah, I think it does come down to those two guys. Sewell, I think, is up there. I'm gonna go Panay Sewell here at number two. Might come as a shocker, but I mean the Jets have. I mean they've actually been able to draft really well on the offensive line. It's just like QBs and head coaches haven't been the greatest. Panay Sewell's been amazing. Coming out of Oregon, he was a left tackle, plays right tackle for the Lions for 5 years, has been an all pro. I don't know every year, but it's been a Pro Bowler, I'm pretty sure every year. It's been amazing. And I mean, if he stays on this trajectory, he will be a Hall of Famer one day. And I think the Jets, who in 2020 took Mekhi Becton, had a decent rookie year to give him you some promise get Sewell. Obviously, with Becton's injury history, Sewell could then play that left side, and you could have that future left tackle of the future. And later on, if they ever still got Rodgers or somebody else, and hey, maybe in this, you know, if they did a redraft, maybe they don't trade Sam Darnold, and maybe you protect them better, get them more weapons, and it works out in the long term. Right, number three with the Niners, obviously not going quarterback. I mean, I think there could be one quarterback like late in the first round. Like, I think these two guys are like the next best QBs because they've at least been somewhat decent in Fields and Jones, but I don't think any other QB, in my opinion, is a first round. Maybe not even, you know, a day one or day two QB in a redraft. I think Chase is a possibility, although they did have both um Debo. They did have both Debo and Brandon Ayuk, so wide receiver is in play. I don't think it was that big. Kyle Pitts, I know some people might say what, but I think Pitts could be an option. Yeah, I think Micah could be an option. Pairing him next to Nick Bosa, I think Sertan is a possibility. There's a lot of really talented players in this class. I think I'm gonna go with Micah. I know it might seem like an interesting pick because the Niners didn't have a need at the edge rusher position, but you just go best player available. And I Parsons rusher has been better than Chase has been a receiver. And I mean, I just imagine if the Mika Ryans had Nick Bosa on one side, Micah Parsons on the other side. I mean, that defense would be scary for years to come. But at a four with the Falcons, I think this is where I'm going to have Chase go. I just think, Julio Jones traded. I think he was still on the team during the draft, but they eventually traded him. Obviously, Calvin Ridley later got suspended for the 2022 season and got traded during the 2022 season. They need a wide receiver. You don't know if you're going to get Drake London signing. Chase makes a lot of sense. And, we give Matt Ryan a wide receiver one. And who knows, maybe if they don't go after Deshaun Watson, they keep Matt Ryan, maybe draft his eventual replacement. Maybe it works out for Atlanta better this way, taking a guy who was probably prospect since entirely stolen. Now the Bengals at five, not going to get chased, not going to get sold. Who are probably the top two options. You look at the offensive line. I mean, Rashawn Slater and Christian Darrisaw, when healthy, are amazing. It's just the injury concerns. Same with Sam Cosmi. Any, great offensive lineman for them to pick with. Wide receiver, I think with how elite this wide receiver group is, there's plenty of guys. Waddle, Smith, Amon Ra, Nico, St. Brown to the Bengals. They still get that elite pass catcher for Joe Burrow. Even though wide receiver wasn't the biggest need, and you could go with like Kyle Pitts at tight end. Maybe, somebody like maybe interior offensive line with like Landon Dickerson, Creed Humphrey. So those would actually make a lot more sense. Yeah, I'm gonna restart. With Trevor Lawrence at one. I'm actually gonna go Chase and give Sam Darnold a legit wide receiver one. Row two. Then I'm actually gonna go. Yes, they had Trent Williams, but imagine if so on on the right side, which he's played in the NFL, and then he could eventually take over for Trent Williams, and that would give you the two tackles of the future. This is where pass rush for a while. There's a reason why they traded their 2026 first to get a second pass rusher, James Pierce, just because they were like, we need it. So Parsons makes a ton of sense. And then here in Cincinnati, I'm actually going to go interior offensive line with Creed Humphrey, which might seem a little high, but I mean, Cincinnati have needed offensive line help. A glaring weakness for a while on this team, and Creed Humphrey, who's been probably the best center since entering the league. end of 2021. Obviously, Jason Kelsey was it, but like I think Humphrey's been amazing talent for being. I think it was a third round pick. I want to say get each center. And maybe if the Bengals invested into this offensive line protecting Joe Burrow, he'd be healthier, and the Bengals wouldn't be having to throw out Jake Browning and Joe Flacco out there when Burrow's injured. The Dolphins at 6, wanting to make sure they got a weapon for Tua, and they're going to get that with Amon-Ra St. Just going to pick later. What with Jalen Waddle, but getting a better player than Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I think they would love that. And St. who has been amazing for the Lions. Imagine him in Mike McDaniel's offense with how great of an offensive line he is, and maybe there's no way you could have guessed that could have went on to the 7th pick with the Lions. I think wide receiver is in play because they don't get they don't get they don't get Amon-Ra St. Brown, so you could go with Nico, Devontae, even Jalen Waddle. I wouldn't hate going with one of those guys. I think offensive line is in play. The interior of Detroit's offensive line wasn't the greatest at this time. Like they had the tackle. Well, they had Taylor Decker. I'm not sure who exactly was their interior offensive line heading into the year, so I might be wrong about this. You could go with certain guys. I think Kyle Pitts could be in play. They had T.J. Hawkinson, but they traded him, so maybe you want to get like a big body receiver type as the tight end. But I'm gonna go corner. It's been a huge need for a while with the Lions, really since they traded away Darius Slay. I don't know Pat Surtain. I just think they've needed corner help for a while since trading away Slay back in 2020. They tried to use a pick on Jeff Okuda, but he never worked out. I think Surtain makes a lot of sense for this Lions team, given the players on the board. I think would instantly have given this defense an elite lockdown corner, to help out. And if they had drafted Surtain, obviously Sewell's been an amazing pick, but maybe if they gone Surtain, I think they would have. I think would have been happy with how things turned out. The Panthers at 8 with J.C. Horn, which could still be the pick. He's been amazing. I think receivers in play. Tight end is in play. I think a lot of things are in play, but I think I'm gonna go interior offensive line. Help out this interior offensive line. I'm gonna go Trey Smith, the other Chiefs offensive lineman that they drafted, I think, in the 6th round. Carolina has had some pretty bad drafting history. You know, have had hits on first round picks like in the Ron Rivera like last couple of years, and the first 2 years of Matt. Well, maybe the first 3, but they've kind of been saying that drafting outside of the first round for a while. So while J.C. Horn does fit a needed corner, offensive line has been a big issue for a while, and Trey Smith would have at least helped this offense in the future. Maybe they still get a Quano, and then you got 2 young offensive linemen to build upon for the future and really fortified an offensive line that was horrible in 2023, leading to the team having to spend a lot of money. The Broncos at 9. I think corner, they went Sertan, so could go Horn, maybe Tyson Campbell, who's been, Colson and Devo, who got overpaid. I think, there could be, the corner could be in play. I think Kyle Pitts is in play. Offensive line is definitely because of how I go interior offensive line with originally took later in the draft and Quinn Miners, who has been amazing for Denver, fortifying this offensive line later into his rookie contract and got extended pretty handsomely by Denver. And I think in a redraft with Sertan off the board, they'd go with Miners to help out this team and really invest into protecting their quarterback, whoever it would have been. Cowboys at 10 corner, definitely in play because a lot of people speculated they wanted Pat Surtain or even Jason Horn, but available. So could go Horn here. I think, with Micah off the board, maybe they potentially look at, drafting Jalen Phillips. I think it'd be a reach. Maybe you go with, trying to think if it's some decent guys, not like elite. So I think, defense was the priority. Linebacker could be a possibility. JOK, although with the injuries, maybe you put him down. Nick Bolton, who had a down season, but I think could bounce back. Jones, who was he ranked 217th with there. I think it's crazy. Yeah, I'm gonna go corner with, linebacker with Nick Bolton. That's what they originally envisioned for Micah, drafting him as the Sean Lee replacement. So I think it makes a lot of sense for them to go with a linebacker here, and Nick Bolton would have solidified that linebacking core, giving this team, the hopeful replacement for Sean Taylor. I think, it would have worked out in Dallas because Dan Quinn, when he did in Atlanta and Seattle with young developing linebackers like Bobby Wagner, Deion Jones, and it would have worked out. What are the Giants at 11? My receiver was the biggest need. Although interior offensive line, really offensive line in general outside of Andrew Thomas has been a big hole. Drew Dolman down here at center is a possibility. But receiver's been a huge need since they traded away OBJ. Tried to draft one here later on when they traded back, but I think in a redraft, they just stay and pick. Again, Nico Collins, who maybe doesn't have the same success that, he had if he was with the Giants, but Collins has been amazing with Houston. He didn't really get going until 2023 when C.J. Stroud came along, so who knows? But it would have given this Giants offense a actual good pass catcher because Kenny Galladay's were horrible signing. Kadarius Toney was a horrible draft. Um, Wino Robinson, later half of his rookie career, rookie contract, started to play a lot better, but Collins would have given them shit elite receivers, and maybe if Daniel Jones hadn't had a guy like Nico Collins, maybe it would have worked out differently. But the Eagles at 12, I think this is where one of the wide receivers from Alabama goes. I'm going to say Jalen Waddle, who just recently got traded for a first round pick from Miami, has been really one of the best receivers. I think underrated because Tyreek Hill kind of took a lot of the attention in being so good those first couple of years in Miami. Waddle's still one of the best young receivers in the league. I think the Eagles, picking maybe they would have still gone Devontae Smith. Jalen Waddle's been the better for Alabama receiver. I think Philly finally getting a good receiver to help out Jalen Hurts for the future. Chargers at 13. Offensive line has been a big, it was a big concern, and you could go Slater. I mean, the injuries very much have hurt him. Same with Christian Darrisaw, Sam Cosmi. So, yeah, offensive line was a big issue. Could go interior offensive line. Um, with Landon Dickerson, ABT. If it wasn't for the injuries, possibly could have him going here. The Chargers could go um with like Robert Haynes, Drew Dahlman. Although they did have a center, so maybe not center prospect. And that offensive line is the big issue. I think helping out this interior, which they tried to do 2022 with Zion Johnson, I think Landon Dickerson makes a ton of sense and would fortify this interior offensive line. Yes, they still needed tackles, and I guess they still needed tackles and would need to protect Justin Herbert's blind side. But Dickerson, you know, health concerns are there, but it's still one of the best guards in the league, and I think would have helped out this Chargers offensive line for the future. Now the Vikings at 14, could go Christian Darrisaw, their original first round pick. I wouldn't hate it. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. This makes a ton of sense. Minnesota, we're testing the offensive line. They started to do after clearly realizing that it wasn't as good as, you know, it was perceived. And, they started losing guys um, in free agency, so they needed to help out. And Darrisaw, when healthy, the first couple of years of his career was amazing. It's just 2024 only played 6 games, and 2025 was in Atlanta with injuries, but when healthy is amazing. And Patriots at 15, not going quarterback. Um, offensive line, and they just lost Joe Tooney, so ABT is a possibility. Maybe a Drew Dahlman at center. I mean, tackles in play. And that offensive line of New England was a work in progress for a while. So Slater, Cosme could be in the ability wide receiver, which they have neglected for a while. Devontae Smith could be like there's multiple different directions they could go in. Maybe they go. I was thinking maybe defense. I mean, I think of JC Horn. Fortify that secondary. But I think I'm gonna go wide receiver. It was a big need for a while. Devontae Smith's off the board. They whipped on N'Keal Harry. I think this was Julian Edelman's final year, I want to say. You know, Patriots have needed wide receiver. They signed guys like Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne who were fine, but they weren't long term pieces. And Smith would have given this team, alongside Jacoby Myers, a nice young wide receiver duo. The Cardinals at 16 could go, and they went with Zaven Collins in real life. So maybe go JOK, maybe go with Ernest Jones. But I think, big need on this team for Miles and interior offensive line. And they center for a decent amount of time. Someone like Drew Dahlman, help out that offensive line that in recent years has been definitely not. You know, drafted Isaiah Simmons, which turns out that he just didn't have a true position, which is why it was kind of hard to plug him into a team. When David Collins the following year, who's been much better than Isaiah Simmons, but I think Dahlman makes a lot of sense and would give this Cardinals offense a really good center to hopefully protect Kyler. We did recently retire for the foreseeable future. Peters at 17, tackle is in play, and I'm going with Rashawn Slater. What Alex Leatherwood, which was a huge reach with Christian Darrisaw still on the board. They needed to address this offensive line because for some unknown reason, Mike Mayock decided to trade. I think it was Gabe Jackson, Rodney Hudson, and I think there was somebody else they traded. They traded like three offense. Oh, and Trent Brown. They traded like three offensive linemen, and really just blew up that entire offensive line outside of Colton Miller. Slater, who has played left tackle, but could have played right tackle. The side of and it could have fortified those tackle positions, really giving this Raiders team, which has not had great drafting for really a while. It's been like 20 plus years of bad drafting. And I think the Raiders look like this pick helping out their future quarterback, whoever that was. Well, the Dolphins at 18 with crossing round at 6. I think, edges in play. Maybe you like Jalen Phillips still. There's not really any other, I think, first round edges you really can classify them as that, just because the edge class has not really been that great. Like Quiddy Pace, Aziz Ojulari, Owe, Russo, even Joe Tryon. Like they've been fine, but not great. I think this could be interior offensive line. I could go AVT because the Dolphins have needed to. We drafted after Austin Jackson, who's been fine. But they needed to improve this interior offensive line for a while. AVT, like, helping out your quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa, protecting him with an elite offensive lineman. I mean, he's not elite, but when healthy is really solid, and was a Jets draft hit, which rarely you can say. To the Commanders at 19. Jamin Davis, a linebacker. I think I'm going to go with JOK, who a lot of people mocked to them. Made a lot of sense. in real life to do it. So they're going to go, and even though the injuries are concerning because coming out of college, you know have the I think it was a heart condition that led him to fall down the boards. Now he might have to be suffered in 2024 and missed all of 2025. But I think Ron Rivera, who was known to get the best out of linebackers like Thomas Davis, Luke Kuechly, Shaq Thompson, I think could have used JOK, would have fortified this front seven, because they had Montez Sweat, Chase Young, Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne. 3 of 4 are now gone. Could have had JOK at the linebacker spot. Would have needed to fix the corners and secondary, but would have given this Washington defense an elite unit. Now the Bears at 20, not going quarterback like they did in real life. I think there's a lot of different positions they could go with. Offensive line was always a big need. So I am going to go Sam Cosmi here, who was a late bloomer for Washington, but has been really solid. Is going was coming off a major injury in 2020 four season when he I think tore his Achilles in the NFC Championship game. So we'll see. Now a full year covered if he you know works out more, if he's playing better, or if the injury he sustained is worse than you know cause him to not be that great. But a Bears team that really had a horrible offensive line for a while finally have gotten fortified recently, but need some help back then. Whoever the quarterback was going to be in this alternate redraft reality, Cosby makes a lot of sense. Now the Colts at 21, you know, I don't really. I mean, you could go edge rusher if you wanted to, like Jalen Phillips, maybe Away, maybe Brousseau, because I think those are the three guys that are could be at this pick. But I think I'm gonna go with defensive tackle. No, the those that need. I am gonna go with safety, possibly. I think could have been an issue. Yeah, I'm gonna go Jamal Holland here. I just think it makes a lot of sense. Like Indy, I mean, I mean they needed to tell about that edge rusher, but I think Holland's a better pick here to really give the Colts, a guy in the back end. They ended up drafting Nick Cross in the following draft, so Holland, and Cross, imagine those two guys secondary. We're at 22 with the Titans. I think this is where the JC Hornfall ends. Originally went Caleb Farley, who was a complete draft bust, just did not work out. I don't even think he was on a roster this past season. And Horn, who when healthy, which he has been the past 2 years, has been amazing, was rightfully paid prior to the 2024 season, maybe 2025, I'm not sure, but was rightfully paid. And Tennessee, who it kind of needed help at that secondary room. Horn would have been a much better pick if he was available and would have helped out this Tennessee secondary. The Jets at where did we go at number two? It was Chase. Now at 23. I don't think there's an offensive lineman to take. The tackle position. Really good like I mean there are like Tim Jenkins, me and Meikenberg if you thought maybe Walker Little, Brady Christensen, but there's no like elite guy. You look at the interior, and now that ABT's gone, – I mean, you could possibly say Robert Hainsey. So, yeah, I think Jets go defense, and they traded away Leonard Williams I think a couple years prior, so they get their new interior guy in Milton Williams. They trade one and they replace him with a new one. This was the Seahawks with the guy on the Jamal Adams trade. So they replace him, you know, and giving Robert Sala a great piece in the interior to help out. Him and John Franklin Myers would have been a scary duo. Steelers at 24. They went running back. I mean, you could say Travis Etienne, maybe Javante Williams, Londre Stevenson, Chuba Hubbard. But, you know, the offensive line you would have hoped, but there's no real guy available. So I think corner is in play because they've always needed corner help. And I'm going to go Tyson Campbell. The Steelers, they've just always needed secondary help. They've always needed, corner for a while. And Campbell helps them out in the back end. It gives them a unique piece, to help out this defense, which for a while was the backbone of this team with how bad the offense was. The Jags at 25, obviously, still pick Trevor Lawrence. Could go Travis Etienne or Travis Etienne with Kyle Pitts at tight end. Yeah, imagine him with Trevor Lawrence. One of the scariest duos. Pitts, who was a freak of nature as a tight end, just has not worked out fully. But I think, maybe the best is coming for him after a great year in 2025. If he continues that success, he'll be able to show that he truly what is an elite player. The Browns at 26 went Greg Newsom originally, so you could go with that pick. Maybe go with Sante Samuel, or I'm gonna go with Colson and Debo, who the Saints found him, which the Saints are great at finding guys late on day 2 and day 3, and Greg Newsom has been fine. The Jags swapped him and Tyson Campbell. Did sign with the Giants to help out that secondary, but I think Debo would have been a better pick, and him and Denzel Ward on the opposite sides. Oh boy. Around the Ravens at 27, I think you would have helped. A receiver would have fell because Ravens have badly needed receiver help, but there's nobody here say is worth taking. See Judon in that in 2021. I'm gonna go with Jalen Phillips, who injuries have been concerning. When on the field is amazing. Imagine if the Ravens drafted him. He was available for the Ravens at 27. They could have landed a stud. Maybe if the Ravens drafted him instead of Oway, maybe they was edge rusher position wouldn't have been as bad as it has been. And they wouldn't have needed to rely on these older veteran guys like Justin Houston and Kyle Van Noy the last couple of seasons. Now the Saints at 28. Yeah, I think this is one of the options if you did want to put a quarterback in, just because the Saints needed one. Could not go in quarterback in this redraft. Though maybe if you guys want to see this next year, one of those guys, you know, has a resurgence in their career and is much better than maybe. But I'm gonna go with defense with I'm gonna go Jason away, Dafe away. Has been a who has been disappointing as a first round pick for the Ravens at 31, but would have been a much better pick than Peyton Turner. And the Saints have kind of tried to get that secondary pass rush. Like I always had Cam Jordan, but they tried it with Marcus Davenport and Peyton Turner, Isaiah Foskey, and I always tried to draft these defensive linemen to help out. They haven't worked out. We'll see. A lot of people think they're going to go with one in 2026, and then they finally hit the lock. But at 29 with the Packers, I think this could be a spot for tight end. I think I'm going to go Pat Fryman, which you might think is an interesting pick, but I think it does make sense. Side and then they had Pat Fryman along with Devontae Adams further than they did. Now the Bills at 31, like edges of secondary, defensive line. Maybe Christian Oso Dickey-Zuo to be in play. They're going to go edge. I'll go with their original first round pick in Greg Rousseau, who's been amazing and really, while he hasn't been this great edge rusher that maybe they wanted him to be as a late first round pick, but he's still been really good. And got a second contract from the Bills, which not many first round picks do. And I think he definitely is really good, for them. Now the Ravens at 31 went with Jalen Phillips. I think secondary is take Bateman. It's kind of an interesting pick. D lineman, 32nd pick. Bucks. It went edge, but I don't think there's any real edges available. Could go linebacker with like Xavier Collins. Maybe into the first round. Bucks. Yeah, that is my 2021 NFL